Hi everybody, I'm Aryan Rasoulipour. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I want to talk about the discourse in the linguistic science. But first, beforehand, I should mention here, I apologize for my absence. I was too busy so I'm recording that podcast after about 3 weeks or a month. Okay, let me start it. A linguistic discourse refers to a language in use, meaning any instance of a spoken, written communication that extends beyond a single sentence. In the study of how larger chunks of language achieve meaning and purpose with a social context. But a question you can ask me here is that what are the characteristics of discourse? Discourse moves beyond simply analyzing grammatical rules at the sentence level, like syntax or morphology, to look at practical real-world function of a language. It varies from this pragmatics, but it's applied in the sentence as well as some pragmatics in practice. But later I will mention in this podcast, what's the differences between pragmatics and discourse. But let me focus right now on discourse. Unit larger than sentence, discourse can be conversation, a speech, an essay, a novel, or just a few words, like to a stop sign that convey a complete meaning in a context. But in the discourse, we should notice that highly significant rule that context is crucial. Meaning in discourse is heavily dependent on the context of communication. This includes the participants, the purpose, the setting, and shared background between participants. I will give some example of any of them. For example, you can imagine hypothetically the participants are two writers people, or somebody who written version of documents belongs to whom. And the purpose could be to inform somebody about some information, to persuade, or to apologize. For example, in the beginning of this podcast, I apologize to you because of my absence. In discourse, in the context of apology, I delivered this sentence to you. And this setting, for example, setting is a scene, is a place, a location that this conversation or dialogue is occurring. For example, in the courtroom, in a classroom, or in a private home, any types of locations. And shared background between participants. What are the stories beyond these participants, beyond this conversation or text? Okay, we should look at this critical element. And the cohesion and coherence are important here for communicating to be successful. And successful communication, a piece of discourse must have a cohesion. What's the meaning of cohesion? The grammatical and lexical links that holds the text together. For example, using the pronouns like she to refer back to previously mentioned person. It's a very good, tough example of cohesion. And about coherence, we should notice that fact, the overall sense of meaningfulness of a text, the logical connection of an idea. Okay, now we should compare discourse by text in comparison and juxtaposition. The text focuses on the product, the static record of language, but the discourse focuses on process, language as it's being used in. And the scope of the text is typically focused on intentional structural cohesion and linguistic feature. But in the discourse, the focus scope is on interaction, focused on social context, communicative purposes, and interpretations. And the nature of both sides are various. For example, the nature of text is non-interactive. For example, we can say a written document analyzed in isolation. There isn't any interaction between people necessarily to analyze a text. But discourse is absolutely interactive, specifying by agents, speakers and writers, listeners and readers, and social purposes. These are key elements you should notice. But in this view, discourse analysis is the academic field dedicated to studying a discourse, and it examines how language functions, how meaning is created, and how communication is structured to achieve specified goals. The key focus in discourse analysis includes turn-taking in conversation. For example, firstly I speak, then you, then she, then he. This is kind of turn-taking in discourse analysis. Or the relationship between language and power and ideology, often called critical discourse analysis field. As a subcategory of discourse analysis, it's considered. And how language constructs identities, for example, professional, gender, and political rules. And the conversational structure of different genres of communication. For example, is it medical discourse or political one? Or it's a speech in classroom talk. This depends on circumstances. And now, as I told you in advance beforehand, and as I want to tell you what's the differences between discourse and pragmatics. These two concepts are closely related areas of linguistic study. Both examine language in context, however, but they differ primarily in scope and focus. As mentioned, what's the scope and focus in variations between discourse and text? The most significant distinction is the unit of analysis. Pragmatics typically focuses on meaning and intention of individual utterances. As an example, for instance, a single sentence or phrase is in the realm of the pragmatics, but how context affects their interpretation is discourse. And sometimes it's overlap with pragmatics. Discourse often a larger unit of language, sequences of sentences, conversations, and texts, and they organizing and functionizing in social setting. But about the unit of focus of an analysis, we can compare in this chart by scales. Pragmatics is the utterance unit of analysis, but discourse could be either textual or interactive unit of analysis. For example, we can apply pragmatics in a sentence, a speech act like, can you pass the salt? It's in the realm of pragmatics should be applied. But when we talk about a conversation, a story, or an article, and a speech, we should notice that a speech is in field that discourse should be considered for it, and discourse analysis also. And about the primary focus, we should say meaning in context is an implied meaning in the pragmatics based on my point of view. For example, the speaker's intent and the listener's interference. But I know that the organization and function of discourse is completely different. For example, how language is structured cohesively and coherently and used to achieve a social goal. This is the target of discourse analysis and discourse, in fact, in linguistics. And the key concepts I can say pragmatics is noticing on speech acts, implications, deixis, or context-dependent words like here, I, something like this, and politeness, in the face theory. In future, I will record a podcast or video about face theory in linguistics as soon as possible, very soon. And taking, cohesion and coherence, thematic analysis and thematic development genre, like medical discourse, is in field, exactly, in discourse field. Yes, true. And when we want to question asked, what does the speaker mean by saying this? We are underlying pragmatics. But when we want to say how is the conversation or text structured and what social functions is performing and where this conversation goes for what, we should consider and apply discourse analysis. And I want to say some overlaps are evident in both fields between discourse and pragmatics. For example, in this realm of context, both fields are shared commitment to studying language in context, moving beyond the language structure alone, like syntax, morphology were before. They explore and convey their context, how context, social, cultural, situational shapes meaning. And they also building blocks system. Pragmatics analyzes often provides at the building blocks for discourse analysis. So, pragmatics is a provider for discourse analysis firstly, and then a piece of discourse is sequence of a speech act that are coherently structured indeed to form a larger meaningful event. And the interaction, the field of conversational analysis, a major part of discourse analysis, is heavily relies on pragmatics and concepts like turn-taking, conventions, and how participants manage their shared understanding. Essentially, pragmatics address the intent and interpretation of individual communicative moves, while discourse addresses the structure of flow and the entire fluation of the entire sequence of movement in language. That's it. Thank you for attending on my YouTube channel and listening to this podcast. Please don't forget to like this podcast video podcast, subscribe my channel, and push the notification for further video that I upload. You'll be notified by YouTube. Until the next time, farewell, have a good time, and good weekends if you're listening to this podcast today. Farewell, goodbye, and good luck.